Good afternoon. Whether you're a first-time attendee or a familiar face, we're grateful that you're joining us today. My name is Amy Hunter. I'm the Foundation and Sponsorship Manager at the CalAsian Foundation. I'm looking forward to having Yellow Chair Collective discuss the historical and present manifestations of anti-Asian hate and how we can heal through racial trauma personally and collectively. Before we dive into today's discussion, I have a few housekeeping notes. To help ensure we have a smooth presentation, please keep your microphones muted until the Q&A portion at the end. Also, please take a moment to grab a paper and pen or pencil, as we'll have a reflection exercise in the presentation. Feel free to keep your videos on if you'd like. It's always great to see your faces. And of course, we encourage you to interact in the chat. Now I'd like to take a moment to recognize our partners and sponsors whose support has made this workshop series possible. Thank you to California Department of Social Services, Stop the Hate, the Sierra Health Foundation, PG&E, and the PepsiCo Foundation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Megan Soun. Megan is a therapist and community program manager at Yellow Chair Collective. She specializes in self-compassion, perfectionism, body image, racial identity, and spirituality. Megan seeks to journey with each client through their pain towards greater flourishing. In addition to working with clients individually, she develops curriculum and leads support groups on topics such as emotion management skills and body image. Passionate about increasing mental health awareness, Megan has given talks and facilitated workshops within a variety of settings such as UC Santa Barbara, Mental Health America, and Blizzard on subjects such as goal setting, self-care, burnout, and BIPOC mental health. Through all that she does, Megan strives to empower people to live and thrive as their true selves. We're excited to welcome her as our honored guest. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey everyone, it's so good to be here with you all. It's fun looking in the chat and just seeing all the work that y'all are doing yourselves. It's very inspiring. Since I've already been introduced, I'm just going to dive right into our presentation today. So I'm talking all about racial trauma and its invisibility in our society. So for our agenda today, a couple of things we'll be going over. So the first is recognizing trauma in the Asian American community. Then we'll talk about what are the effects of trauma, especially on our mental health. Then how do we heal from trauma? And then finally, we'll save some time for Q&A. So to start with, I want to lead us in a grounding exercise. And just to give a little background on why I wanted to start here, I think one thing is just often we're coming from different things. Maybe you've been working all day, just coming from another meeting. And so it can be nice to take a moment for grounding. But also, I think in particular with trauma, things from the past feel really present. So whatever past feelings, past physical sensations, past beliefs we've developed about ourselves and the world in response to traumatic events, they often resurface and affect our present moment. And so one of the ways that we can heal from trauma and ground is learning how do we come back into the present moment. And so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is a common, really simple way of doing that engages our senses and helps us to attune to our present moment. So for this, you're welcome to turn off your cameras and go ahead and get in a comfortable seat. And I'm going to go ahead and just invite you all to take a few deep breaths on your own. And now I invite you to look around and you're going to notice 5 things that you see. And as you do this, I encourage you to pay attention to the details of what you're noticing. So let's say you're noticing your water bottle, notice the color, notice the texture. I think the more you can tune into the details, the more you can tap into the present moment. Now I want you to notice 4 things that you hear. And next, name 3 physical sensations that you can notice. So that could be something like noticing the chair touching the back of your legs. Now notice 2 things that you can smell. And finally, I want you to name 1 emotion that you're feeling right now. And go ahead and take another deep breath on your own, breathing in and out. And once you're ready, if you feel comfortable, I invite you to turn your cameras back on and we will dive into your content. Okay, so we're going to start with recognizing trauma in the AAPI communities. Throughout the presentation today, I'm going to be using these terms AAPI and Asian American. But just want to give a quick acknowledgement that AAPI and Asian American both refer to a very wide and diverse array of people and cultures. We're not a monolith, and so want to give that caveat even as I'm using these terms. So the first thing I want to begin with is broadening our conception of trauma. So most commonly when we think of trauma, we think of the way that it's been defined in the DSM, which is what a lot of mental health providers or other health providers use to diagnose, and especially to diagnose PTSD. So in the DSM, in order to have PTSD, you have to have some event that's considered life-threatening. So it could be a serious injury or death, direct encounters of violence, sexual violence. You'll notice a lot of these examples are very physical. But there's also other forms of trauma, invisible trauma, and these are a lot more harder to grasp because they're not always caused from a single event. Sometimes they're a result of a combo of different factors, including cultural conditions, our environment, and upbringing. And I think when we have a too narrow of a definition of trauma, like the recognized trauma on the left, it can lead us to think that other types of trauma, like invisible trauma, are less valid, or sometimes people think that they haven't suffered enough to use the language of trauma to describe their own experiences. So we're going to be talking about this invisible trauma in the Asian American community. And there's 2 main types that I think constitute invisible trauma. So the first is racial trauma. That's the psychological and physiological harm that results from racism, microaggressions, and racialized events. That's really where the bulk of today's presentation will be focused on. And we're going to break it down into both historical trauma and then also present day manifestations. And then there's also intergenerational trauma. So this is known as the trauma that is passed down from one generation to the next. So one generation experiences traumatic events, and that can have really lasting effects on future generations. I won't be talking about that today, but my colleague Esther will be talking about that for part 3 of this series. So stay tuned for that. So diving into historical trauma, I wanted to ask a question to you all in the chat. What did you learn about Asian Americans or AAPI folks in your history class growing up? Feel free to put in the chat any subjects, topics. I'm saying not much right there with you. I don't remember learning much either. Japanese internment, Chinese Exclusion Act, we'll talk about those a little bit more today. The Vietnam War, the gold rush. Yeah, it feels like a lot of us had similar experiences. I think often the only thing taught in school are those few things. So the gold rush, when Chinese immigrants came to work on the transcontinental railroad, World War II. So some of y'all are mentioning Pearl Harbor and the internment camps, and then the Vietnam War, and that's kind of it. And I think having this really narrow conception of Asian American history really flattens our understanding of the reality of Asian American history in the US. And I think these particular things that are focused on the gold rush, Pearl Harbor, the Vietnam War, all of them represent Asians as outsiders, enemies, or desperate refugees. And so it paints this very particular picture of Asian Americans. So we're going to go over a couple of historical traumas in America's past, some of which were mentioned in the chat, some which weren't. There's so many more than what I'm going to discuss today, so I just wanted to name that, but we'll talk about some of the really significant ones that have happened. So someone put in the chat, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So this was actually the first significant law restricting immigration of any sort into the US. And in this act, there was a 10-year ban prohibiting the immigration of Chinese laborers. And then Chinese residents who were already here were now ineligible to become citizens. And if you look at this newspaper clipping, it really highlights the sentiment of the public attitudes towards the Chinese at the time, which is a lot of animosity. And as I was putting this presentation together, I saw a lot of other really sad sentiments like this being expressed in the newspaper. Next is another Immigration Act. So this is the Immigration Act of 1917 now, and it banned much of the Pacific and Asia from entering into the US. So this map shows all the areas where people who originated from these different places could not immigrate to the US. Next, we have Japanese internment during World War II, which is considered really one of the most horrific violations of civil rights in America in the 20th century. So during World War II, the US forcibly relocated and incarcerated about 112,000 people of Japanese descent, and about 70,000 of those were American citizens. And then getting a little bit more recent, the murder of Vincent Chin is a really significant moment in Asian American history. So essentially, if you don't know what happened, was in Detroit in 1982, Vincent Chin, who was a Chinese American man, was killed in a racially motivated assault by two white men. These killers blamed the Chinese for the economic decline that had been caused by the decline of the auto industry in that area. And I think in addition to the murder itself, another really tragic component of Vincent Chin's story was the sentencing that happened in the aftermath. So in the sentencing, there were only 15 minutes of proceedings, and then Charles Kaufman, who was the sentencing judge, only sentenced the two murderers to 3 years probation and $3,000 in fines. And then as Kaufman explained his sentence, he said, "These aren't the kind of men that you send to jail." So this moment really ignited the modern Asian American civil rights movement because people were so angered by the injustice that had been experienced. And the final thing I'll talk about, but of course there are many more incidents, is post 9/11 racial profiling and discrimination. So after 9/11, there was a lot of increased discrimination towards Muslims and people of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Arab descent. And I think crucially, this discrimination was government sanctioned as well. So the US government marked people of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Arab descent, and then Muslims broadly, as presumed national security threats and targeted their communities for mass surveillance, which really reinforced Islamophobia and xenophobia. And I think it also, this racial profiling highlights a really common feature of racism, which is how particularities of non-white folks are often erased. Middle Easterners, South Asians, and Arabs were all lumped together, despite these folks representing a myriad of cultures, languages, histories, religions, and ethnicities. So those are just a couple of examples of historical trauma. I wanted to ask in the chat, I want you to just put one or two words in the chat to describe your emotional reaction to hearing some of these historical traumas. Yeah, I'm noticing a lot of sad, angry, powerless, frustrated. Yes, to all of those things. I think one of the reasons I wanted to take this little moment to check in and name what we're feeling is there's a concept created by psychologist Daniel Siegel called Name It to Tame It. And essentially, the essence of this concept is that naming our emotions is a really important part to moving through them. So I think a lot of times, historical traumas that have happened in the Asian American community have not even been acknowledged and recognized. And so I think making space to acknowledge and to notice that what we feel is really important. I want to give a warning that we're going to keep talking about racial trauma in a minute and talk about its present day manifestations. We will, after that, follow that with how do we heal? And hopefully that will start to address some of the powerlessness being felt. But please note that if you need to take a pause during this presentation, do more grounding, whether it's the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 or something else, you're more than welcome to do that. Take care of yourselves during this time. Okay. So now moving into talking about present day racial trauma. So we're going to break this down into two different ways of looking at this. So this is the discrimination iceberg, and essentially over the water, the top of the iceberg represents overt discrimination. So things like hate crimes, poor treatment, forms of discrimination that are readily observable, and we'll start there and then we'll move into the more covert aspects of things under the waterline. So covert or more subtle racism includes things like implicit attitudes, and we'll define all of that in a moment. We're not going to talk as much today about the structural components of racism, things like racial ideology and institutional policies and segregation, but that is also a really crucial piece of this as well. Okay, so talking about some of the more explicit or overt forms of discrimination for the Asian American community more recently. So in 2020 to 2021, in general, reported hate crimes rose by more than 11% across the US. But for Asian Americans, hate crimes against them rose the most by over 167%. And that was just within 1 year, from 2020 to 2021. You may have heard of Stop AAPI Hate. They have a reporting center where you could submit incidents of hate that have been experienced. And over the first 2 years that they started, so that was March 2020 to March 2022, individuals across the country reported 11,467 incidents. And out of those incidents reported, 2 out of the 3 involved harassment, such as verbal or written hate speech or inappropriate gestures. And then sadly, it's really likely that these incidents were very underreported because Stop AAPI Hate found that only 1 in 5 AAPI individuals who experienced discrimination reported it. And there's lots of reasons for that, things like language barriers or maybe mistrust of the agencies accepting this information or fear of consequences. For instance, if you don't have citizenship status, it can be really scary to report things like this. So in another survey that was conducted by Stop AAPI Hate, they found some of these were the most significant reasons for discrimination. So 82% said discrimination happened because of race, ethnicity, national origin, skin color, or language. 31% reported discrimination linked to sex, gender, gender identity, or gender expression, 20% linked to religion, 18% linked to immigration or citizenship status. The reason why the numbers don't add up to 100 is that you could indicate more than one. And then where discrimination occurred. So in that same survey, amongst the reported incidents of discrimination, 51% reported discrimination as a customer of a business, 47% experienced it as an employee or job applicant, 36% as a student, 26% as a rider of public transportation, 26% as a member of the public seeking government services, and 23% as a renter or buyer of housing. And then finally, the types of discrimination that were recorded in this survey, they found that about 67% were linked to harassment, 16% physical assault, 16% avoidance or shunning, 8.6% occurred online, and then I think this was increasingly common during the pandemic, which was 8% reported incidents of being coughed at or spat on. So now we're going to shift into the more covert forms of racism, particularly implicit attitudes. And I want to start by covering some definitions first. So first is stereotype. A stereotype is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. I'll give lots of examples for that in a moment. And then bias refers to disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing, usually in a way that's closed-minded, prejudicial, and unfair. So we'll unpack how these land for the Asian American community in a moment. But before doing so, I want to ask you all to put in the chat, what are some of the stereotypes or biased comments that you've heard about AAPI folks? Yeah, I'm seeing smart, even at certain subjects, things like math, being really compliant, docile, submissive, not being good at driving. Yeah, it seems like a lot of people are talking about that sentiment of being seen as too quiet, too compliant, not aggressive, so you can't progress in the workplace because you're not seen as a leader. And someone put about even just the intersectionality between being API and being a woman and how that further reinforces all those stereotypes. Things related to sexuality. Yeah, a big focus on East Asians and thinking about Asian as just folks from countries like China and Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and not including Southeast Asians or South Asians. Yeah, a lot of similar sentiments. We're going to talk more about these in a moment. So here's just a list of some of the ones that we'll expand upon today. So things like the model minority myth, being good at math and sciences, quiet and submissive, yellow peril and yellow terror, China flu, exclusion of non-East Asians, the crazy rich Asian, being competent but cold, socially awkward, and the bamboo ceiling. So let's dive in a little bit more deeply. Okay, so first I want to start with explicit bias against Asian Americans. And so those are forms of bias where it's conscious. You're aware of your thoughts and emotions towards a specific group, and it takes the form of things like hate speech, discrimination, and prejudice. So an example of this is the historic concept of yellow peril, or also it's sometimes called yellow terror. And basically the message underneath that is that Asian immigrants are taking jobs away from the American people. And then during the pandemic, there were also comments from former President Trump concerning the China flu, to refer to COVID. And this really, I think, partially led to the general public associating Asians with the COVID-19 virus and discriminating against them regardless of any actual involvement with the pandemic. And then there's implicit bias. So implicit bias is that unconscious bias that still can come out in comments or assumptions. So as an example, I'm Taiwanese American, but I grew up in the South. I grew up in Tennessee, and there were not many other Asian folks around me. And so when I was in school, I remember when we would get papers passed back to us, my peers would sometimes ask me, Megan, what grade did you make? And if I said, oh, I made an A, they would say, well, of course you did well, you're an Asian. And I always wonder how people would have responded if I didn't do well on that paper, or if I wasn't doing well in school. How would they have grappled with that? And then I always noticed too that when my white classmates did well in school, no one indicated that their academic performance had anything to do with their race or their ethnicity. And then there's also workplace bias. So some of you were touching upon this in the chat, and I think this is a really common area where bias shows up. So research shows that people like to hire people that look like them, people that they feel like they can relate to. And this can really negatively impact Asian Americans who are looking for jobs, particularly jobs that aren't traditionally held by many Asian Americans. So for example, I have a client who is in the entertainment industry, and she was recently auditioning for a theater company, and she didn't get the part because she was told that there were too many Asians already. So things like that, where there's quotas, there's ideas of who belongs in what area. And then as some of y'all put, Asian American employees can be seen as smart and competitive and obedient, but also quiet and not aggressive enough, cold, socially awkward. And as a result, I think some workplaces can really discriminate against Asian professionals, both in hiring or also in the process of promoting. So this is referred to as the bamboo ceiling. You may have heard of the glass ceiling, so that refers to those invisible barriers that make it difficult for women to get promoted in the workplace. This is the same concept, but now applied to Asian Americans. So another example here is some of the Asian clients I work with have talked about how they've struggled in the workplace getting promotions because they've been told they're not assertive enough, and that makes them not a good leader. And it's really frustrating because some of these clients, they immigrated over from a different country where there isn't necessarily this elevation of being assertive, and it's actually sometimes seen as impolite to do so. And so I think when companies here have these really arbitrary hierarchies about what does it mean to be a good worker that don't take into account cultural differences, it's really frustrating because they are problematizing things that are more of a cultural difference rather than something that actually is an indicator that you're not a good worker or that you wouldn't be a good leader. I think there's also bias that's played off as jokes commonly. So even though these aren't actually funny, and they're actually a form of verbal harassment. So for example, there's the mocking of eye shapes. Um, as a kid, I remember so often the kids in my school would pull at their eyes and say, "This is what I would look like if my mom was Chinese." Or I've had friends in the past just straight up tell me that my eyes are weird. And then there's also a mimicking of different Asian accents. So I find it really striking that Americans see certain accents as desirable or even sexy accents like British accents or Italian accents, but then Asian accents are seen as funny and embarrassing. And of course, there is the outright verbal harassment of Asian immigrants being told to speak English, which is just so harmful. And I think it can make it difficult for Asian Americans of all ages to feel comfortable with their features and their languages. And then, as previously mentioned, there's also a stereotype of the crazy rich East Asian. As mainstream media, when we do have Asian representation, it's typically rich and wealthy East Asians. So, um, thinking about Bling Empire or Crazy Rich Asians, the movie. And then I think mainstream media tends to exclude non East Asians entirely. So, we rarely have South or Southeast Asians. They tend to not be acknowledged, and their experiences tend to be rendered really invisible in West Asians as well. Okay, now we're going to talk about some of the examples of microaggressions. So these are those everyday, subtle, slight put downs or offensive behaviors that people experience, and they can be intentional or unintentional. So microaggressions often express the implicit attitudes, those unconscious attitudes that we hold. And we're going to talk about some of the common ones that happen in the AAPI community and then what the underlying attitudes are that they reflect. So the first theme is being an alien in our own land. So these examples communicate this idea that Asian Americans are forever foreigners, no matter how long we've lived here. So common example is, where are you from? No, where are you really from? So I've gotten this, I don't even know how many times, but I tell people I'm from Tennessee and they say, no, where are you really from? The answer being Tennessee. Um, the worst example I have of this is there was a time where I was sitting on a plane between two white men who had just met. They were strangers on a plane as well. And one turns to the other and points to me and says, "What do you think she is?" Um, again, communicating this idea that it doesn't matter how long you've been in America, you're still a foreigner. And I think in that instance, maybe not even fully human. Another example of this is, wow, your English is so good. I think this makes a lot of assumptions, not only about capability, but also about education. Another common microaggression is the model minority myth. So this myth assumes that Asians are innately capable and have cultural norms that enable their success and that they're all successful. And we'll talk a little bit more about the history of this myth in a moment. But of course, this messaging isn't true. It completely erases the significant income disparity amongst different Asian ethnic groups in America. It also doesn't acknowledge that different groups have different levels of academic achievements and performance due to differences in background. So a lot of times people perpetuating this myth think they're complimenting Asians. They think it's a good thing to say that Asians are good at math or science. But this assumption actually erases the fact that some Asian students aren't good at math and science. They might need more support, they might struggle, and that's totally okay. So I think the other thing I want to add too is it also can erase the challenges, the pain, the experience, the racism experienced by this community too. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But some examples of this are, you're Asian, so you must be good at school. You'll definitely make a lot of money, or things like Asians are good workers because they do the work and don't complain. The next theme is improper comparison. So comments like these assume that the other person knows just as much about the Asian American experience, even if it's not their identity. So an example of this is if a white woman, for instance, were to say, as a white woman, I know how you feel to be a minority. I think in this, the underlying message being communicated is that the unique Asian American experience is dismissed, or it could be fully understood by someone who hasn't had this experience. And then another common one is saying something to the effect of, I'm more Asian than you are because I've been to Japan, or I'm more Asian than you are because I listen to K-pop. In these sorts of examples, I think Asian ethnic background is really minimized and boiled down into a small thing for consumption. And I think this also taps into something we'll talk about a little bit later too, of it can tap into the shame and the guilt and the confusion that a lot of Asian Americans feel about not being Asian enough or American enough. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Okay, and then the fourth theme is poor cultural comparison. So these statements assume that Asian people are all the same and completely erases the vaster diversity of the Asian continent. So, as an example, if you were to say something like, oh, you're Cambodian, I've been to Thailand several times. Two different countries. This idea, this messaging assumes that Asia is totally homogenous, it's a monolith. But if you think about it, let's flip the script. Let's say someone met an American. What if you were to say something like, oh, I have a brother whose friend went to Canada? It doesn't really make any sense. It's illogical. Or the second example there, oh, you're Vietnamese. My friend's wife is Vietnamese. Um, I'm sure a lot of you can relate to if you're from a certain country, people telling you that they've know someone who is loosely associated with the country. And it feels like, well, what does this have to do with me? I think this assumption also assumes that certain communities are small and ignores a person's particularity, their individuality. Okay, so I just gave a ton of content about different forms of discrimination and all sorts of microaggressions. And so I actually want us to take about 3 minutes or so for some self-journal reflection. And so I want you to think of some of the racial microaggressions that you've been on the receiving end of, and then journal about how did these make you feel. So for this, again, feel free to turn off your video and I'll call us back in about 3 minutes. And we'll resume. Let's continue on, but feel free to check out the chat. People are putting all sorts of examples that really exemplify some of the microaggressions I've talked about today. Things like the pathologizing of cultural norms, the assuming that all Asian cultures are the same, all these examples, and people, there's so many of them, which I think just highlights how common these things are. Um, as some people are putting in the chat, they're coming from different states and yet they've experienced these things all over the US, and they're quite common. And yet it's heartbreaking how common they are. So to continue on, we're going to talk a little bit about internalized racism now. So this is biases within one's own culture or ethnic group towards oneself or others. So what can this look like? It can look like a lot of different sorts of things like avoiding your cultural traditions, dishes, native language, trying to dress or appear closer to white beauty standards, wishing that you weren't Asian or hating your own background, or trying to separate yourself from Asian identity and refusing to associate with other Asian people. So I've been talking about how I grew up in Tennessee, and I think as a result of that and that experience of being one of the few Asian folks, I had a lot of internalized racism growing up. So I remember as a kid, I would watch YouTube videos on how to make it look like I have the double eyelid. I would be really excited when people would say something like, "Oh, you're pretty. You must be half Asian," and in that indicating the sense of the only thing that could make me pretty is being less Asian than I am. But at the time, I had so much internalized racism that I would be really excited about those sorts of comments. And then I remember that when I went off to college, I was asked by my mom or other folks if I was planning to join any Asian student associations, and I would immediately say no. And I really intentionally sought friends that weren't Asian because I wanted to distance myself from these parts of myself and essentially try to be as white as I could. The hard thing is, on top of all of this trauma, there's also the dismissal of Asian racial trauma. So someone was putting that in the chat a minute ago of how their own experiences, not only did they have to experience the pain of the trauma itself, but then have other people say, you haven't really gone through anything hard, or Asian folks don't really get to count as minorities in the US. And so I want to talk about some of the different reasons why I think racial trauma in this community is invisible and even dismissed, and to really emphasize again just how harmful it is. I think anytime you experience trauma, it's awful, awful, but then to have people say your pain isn't real just makes it all the more worse. So now we're going to talk about 3 different myths that I think contribute to this invisibility. So the first is the model minority myth that we've been talking about. So this myth, again, characterizes Asian Americans as the exemplar minority group in the US to which other minority groups are created. I think it's really important to realize there were very specific reasons why this myth was created and reinforced and continues to be reinforced today. So the first is that during World War II, the Roosevelt administration was interested in ensuring good treatment of Chinese Americans because China was an ally to the US against Japan during the war. So to achieve this, the government tried to portray Chinese Americans as peaceful, law-abiding individuals. The second thing is that many Japanese Americans, after they were released from American internment camps after the war, they were really determined to work hard and prove their loyalty to the US so that their lives were not taken away from them again. So sociologist William Peterson coined the term model minority in a story for the New York Times called Success Story Japanese American Style, where basically Peterson highlighted the success of Japanese Americans despite all the atrocities they had faced during the war. And then he compared their success to other minority groups in the US, whom Peterson believed had not fared as well. So similar to what Peterson was talking about, the model minority myth was used to undermine the social and political impact of the Black civil rights movement as well, with the premise being, hey, look, other minority groups can succeed without demanding equal rights. And in this sort of reasoning, it puts the blame on certain people of color rather than all the systems and forces that have created this discrepancy and inequality. The next is the perpetual foreigner myth that we've been talking about. So again, this stereotype where no matter how long you've been in the US, you're still seen as an Asian American. This myth has been created and maintained by the media, private, public sectors, public officials. Many of y'all have talked about comments in the chat where you've experienced something to this effect. Even the idea of being told to go back to your country. Well, what if this is the country you're from? This picture is actually of someone named Ava Chin, who's a fifth generation Chinese American. So she wrote this nonfiction book called Mott Street, which traces her family's origin in America beginning in the 1860s, and then how her family struggled to find their place in America due to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that we talked about. So there are people who've been a part of this country for so long, and yet despite these folks having been here for centuries, that we're still treated as foreigners, we're still asked, where are you from? I also heard this interesting thing at one point. I still use the language of generation, I'm second generation, because I think it can connote certain experiences and struggles and strengths, but at the same time, someone once pointed out, which I thought was interesting, of why is it that we use this generation language? Does it reinforce actually this perpetual foreigner idea by talking about our generation? Because unless you are Indigenous, everyone has had someone in their family immigrate over to the US. And so, but no one else uses this generation language. So I thought that was really interesting. And then finally, there's the Black-white binary. So this myth essentially looks at racial history through a paradigm where it's only a story between white and Black Americans in the US. And this paradigm can really ignore and exclude the racial history and racism experienced by Asian Americans and all other people of color that don't identify as Black Americans. So I remember when I was in college, there were lots of conversations going on about race, but anytime an Asian person would share about their own experiences of race and racism, they would get silenced by white, Black, even other Asian folks in the audience and say, hey, that doesn't really matter here. And so I think it again reinforces this idea of your pain, your racism doesn't matter or is not as tangible. So what are the problems with these myths? I think the first is that they ignore challenges that the Asian communities have faced. There have been very real challenges. We've been talking about that all today. And a lot of these things have been created and exacerbated by the government or government-supported discrimination and violence. I think the model minority myth in particular invalidates the struggles of Black Americans as a way of comparing their community struggles against the successes of the Asian American communities. And then finally, these myths tap into this theme that keeps emerging today, where the experiences of all Asian Americans are equated, and it really erases the inherent diversity of Asian American communities. So, for example, in the 1970s, there were a lot of Southeast Asians, so Cambodians, Vietnamese, Hmong, Laotian refugees who had been directly impacted by colonization, war, and imperialism who immigrated to the US. And their experiences are going to be really different from other Asian Americans who may have immigrated to the US to pursue higher education, and it was really by choice. Okay, so now we're going to move into the hopefully more hope-filled part of our presentation today. First, I'm going to talk about some of the mental health effects, but then I'm going to tie that in with now how do we heal? So talking about the effects first, I'm going to talk about some of the general effects as well as some very specific effects and ways that trauma can manifest in the AAPI community. So in terms of the general effects, I'm going to talk about what we call in the mental health field biopsychosocial, so the psychological, biological, social effects of racial trauma at large. So these can include things like anxiety, depression, irritability, suicidality. Biological effects can include things like increased risk of stroke, cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, and then social risks can include things like dropping out of school, reduced attendance, substance use, gang activity. But now I want to talk about some of the specific ways that racial trauma can land for the AAPI community. So the first is dissonance in our identities. I think for Asian Americans, their bicultural identity often results in these questions of, am I Asian or am I American? There are these feelings of, I don't feel Asian enough, I don't feel American enough. Western and Eastern ideologies can be really different. There can be really differing values and customs. So for example, Eastern values may prioritize collectivism, whereas Western values may exalt individualism more. Asian Americans also might not speak their ancestry's language anymore. They may be told from the Asian side of their family or culture that they're not Asian enough, or even as some of y'all put in the chat, they might be told from non-Asian folks that they're not Asian enough. And then in America, Asians are constantly seen as perpetual foreigners and not belonging. So all of this creates this feeling like you don't fully belong to either culture, which really results in this dissonance, this tension with their sense of identity. And I think it can also produce negative core beliefs that can arise that they're inadequate, not good enough, not worthy. So I really like this quote that that is in the book that Yellow Chair's co-directors wrote. I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but this quote was from Amanda, who's a Vietnamese Filipina American, and she wrote, "To me, being Asian American means holding space for multiple truths. I imagine walking on a tightrope, trying to balance multiple identities, afraid that a slip in one direction would mean letting go of the other." I think this quote, this image of being on the tightrope, highlights how hard it is to hold together both our Asian and American culture and identity. Next, I'm going to talk about guilt and shame and how these can result from trauma and also get in the way of trauma recovery. So to start with, I want to talk about the distinction between guilt and shame. So guilt is really about actions and behaviors. It focuses on our behaviors, our values, rather than worth. And it can be a really natural, healthy response when we feel we do something we shouldn't have done. And you can still feel, because it's so behavior focused, you can still feel bad about the behavior, but maintain respect and care for yourself. Whereas shame is this really painful feeling or experience of believing we're flawed. And it focuses on our self-worth and feelings of being unlovable. And it's a less healthy, very personalized response to feeling we didn't do something right. And in the process of shame, you often lose self-respect. You allow shame to define who you are as a person. So Brene Brown, she has this quote where she says, guilt is I've done a bad thing versus shame is I am bad. So now talking about how they can affect trauma recovery. So guilt, though it can be really difficult to sit with, can be a useful emotion. When we listen to, when we process guilt and we want to right or wrong, it allows us to take ownership of our behavior. When you take responsibility for the mistakes you make, you work to apologize and correct those mistakes, you are taking steps on the road to relationship recovery. So acting on guilt and moving towards repair and healing can be an important part of reconciling with yourself and with others. But when we experience racial trauma or even other forms of trauma, we can really feel shame and then develop negative beliefs about ourselves. Things like, I'm unlovable, or I'm undeserving of good things, or I'm worthless. And then when these beliefs become embedded in our narratives about ourselves, they become really big barriers to mental wellness and trauma recovery. A big part of trauma recovery is learning to separate out our past traumas from our present reality. But when you think that you're the problem, this work can be really difficult. And you might even think that you're not worthy to receive care. And then finally, grief. So in the next presentation, we'll be diving more into grief surrounding trauma, especially in the Asian American community. But I want to talk about it a little bit here. So I think similarly to how trauma is often given a really narrow definition, grief is often confined to death of losing a loved one. But I think grief can actually be much more expansive. I think for Asian Americans, our experience is often marked by so much absence and loss. We really have ongoing cumulative grief from living under systems of racism and white supremacy. There's grief that happens in the process of immigration, assimilation, grappling with our racial identities. And this grief can feel really ambiguous because the loss might not be visible or obvious. And then I think on top of that, we often haven't been given enough space to process this grief. In order to survive, our ancestors often pushed aside their pain and grief so that they could keep moving forward. Survival really meant embracing the future and didn't provide space to process disappointment and loss. And when we feel this constant pressure to push forward, we don't allow ourselves to properly mourn what could have been. So this quote talks about grief isn't just about death, it's about the what if. I think about this sometimes in my own life of, again, having internalized racism as a kid, trying to distance myself from things that I felt were more Asian. So I played the violin growing up, but I didn't invest a lot in it because I didn't want to. I didn't want to be seen as someone who plays the violin. And then also, I didn't really work on my Mandarin. My parents would speak Mandarin to me, but I would always respond in English. And now, as an adult who's really grappled with all of this stuff, these are some what ifs I have of like, what if I had been willing to learn Mandarin at that time? What if I had invested more in violin and not felt ashamed of that? What would life look like now? So for the sake of time, we'll just take a minute for this, but I want you to reflect on an example of racial grief that you'd like to acknowledge and honor, and maybe start to think about the significance of this loss to you. So just take a moment to maybe jot down something that comes to mind for you. I encourage you to think more deeply about whatever you put down later and really take space to honor that loss. With these losses, even if they aren't about death, they can still be real, they can still be devastating and painful, and I think they are worthy of being honored and acknowledged. And so I encourage you to just take some time later to do that work. Okay, now moving on to the healing from trauma piece. So I think one of the really important things is being conscious about race-based stress and trauma in our lives. Even that attunement, I think, is really important given everything we've talked about today about how racial trauma is often invisible to the world. And so we similarly can ignore our own racial trauma, try to push through, disregard our experiences of racism. So I think first being attuned to that, and then now we're going to talk about some of the specific ways that you can learn to heal from trauma. The reason why I put this picture of a toolbox here is I want you to think about this next portion as creating your own personalized toolkit, finding what works for you. So take what's helpful, leave behind what's not, and you might even want to try experimenting with the different suggestions to see what works best for you. So the first thing is take a break or get involved. So in response to racism, some people find their healing from unplugging, from shifting their attention and energy to other things, whereas others find healing from engaging in activism. You might do one thing and another thing at a different time or both, and your way of coping doesn't have to look the same as another person's. Activism to me might look really different than activism to you. Point of all of this is to take care of yourself and be compassionate towards yourself. The next thing is self-care. I think when we think about self-care, we often have this really one-dimensional conception of self-care. It's self-care is doing yoga or getting a massage, but it's actually really multidimensional. So I'm just going to go over some of the common areas or dimensions that can be associated with self-care. So there's physical things like walking or stretching. Emotional self-care can look like going to therapy or journaling. Social self-care can look like spending time with friends or setting boundaries with others. Spiritual self-care can look like prayer or meditation or spending time in nature. I really like this one. Personal forms of self-care can look like things like engaging in things that feel authentically you, or your hobbies or your goals. Space self-care can look like creating a really clean space around you, having a safe, healthy environment. Financial self-care are things like saving or budgeting, and then work forms of self-care can include things like time management or creating boundaries around your work. So I'm going to ask you all to put in the chat, what is one category of self-care that you would like to focus on? Here are the categories again if you need them. Yeah, I love that everyone's putting different ones, and I think it highlights the overarching message I want to get across in this section of everyone needs different things, different ways for healing, and that's totally fine. Figure out what you need and what works for you. Okay, the next suggestion is to join a supportive community. So you might consider joining a support group for Asian Americans. So for example, what that can look like is at Yellow Chair, the practice I work for, we offer all sorts of support groups for Asian Americans on different topics, things like trauma recovery or perfectionism, or emotion management are some of our upcoming ones. And oftentimes when I lead these groups, one of the things members will talk about is how being just in a space with other Asian folks is the most healing part of the group. Other ideas are joining clubs or online communities where you can meet others with your identity, or you might want to invest more time and energy in building your friendships with other Asian Americans. And then the next piece is embracing your cultural and racial identity can be really hard when you've received all sorts of messaging across your life that your racial and cultural identity don't belong here or they're inferior. So I think it's important to take time to really work on embracing. And so that can look like learning about your cultural heritage and history, honoring the unique experiences and strengths that exist in your culture, consuming books, shows, social media with Asian American representation, tracing your family journey, and reflecting on your racial identity and what it means to you. So I want to ask you all to put in the chat, what are some AAPI authors, artists, books, shows, movies, podcasts you'd recommend? I'm asking this question partially for y'all and partially for me to get more reps, but I think this is a fun way to practice embracing our cultural identity more. Share one really quick. I read a lot of books around AAPI themes this year, but probably my favorite by far is They Called Us Exceptional and Other Lies I've Loved by Prachi Gupta. Um, but yeah, loving these recs in the chat. Okay, feel free to keep putting things in the chat even as they go on. The next thing I want to talk about is be gentle with your response when you do experience racism. So choose what feels right to you. I think a lot of times victims of racism criticize and blame themselves for not responding. But a lot of times our responses to racism are automatic, things that we don't really have control over. They're trauma responses, things like fight or flight. And then there's also cost to both confronting and not confronting. If we don't confront, we might feel shame, guilt, helplessness. We might ruminate excessively. If we do confront, we might face social and employment repercussions and even threats and violence. So just give yourself permission to respond and cope in a way that works with you and be really gentle with whatever that response is. And then honor your feelings. Don't gaslight yourself, acknowledge and honor your experiences. Remember that you're not just responding to one act of racism. Often you're carrying a lifetime of being hurt by racism. And so don't tell yourself that that's not a big deal or maybe you're overreacting. Honor what's happened and offer yourself self-compassion. And then finally, when to seek professional help. So some of the indicators that it might be time are not feeling like yourself, feeling off, social withdrawal, trauma reactions happening more and more, thoughts of wanting to die or not wake up, addictive behaviors, extreme mood swings, and significant change in your habits or lifestyle. Something you might want to do is seek out a BIPOC therapist or maybe particularly another therapist who shares your racial or cultural identity. I know since we're a practice that focuses a lot on Asian Americans, a lot of my clients will talk about how they've had non-Asian therapists that they felt like they just had to explain so much of their culture and their experiences and their family too, and that really got in the way of doing effective work. So you might want to seek out someone who shares your identity. And then finally, here's just a list of resources. You'll get these later. One I wanted to highlight that I touched upon is the book written by our co-directors, Where I Belong, because it specifically talks about healing trauma and embracing Asian American identity. So it covers lots of common themes that we talked about today. And then finally, I think we have like 4 minutes left. Don't know if people have questions. If so, feel free to put them in the chat. And I'll also pass it back to you, Amy.
And then also too, if anyone has any questions, whether you put in the chat or if you want, you can also unmute and ask any questions as well.
Can you share that slide with the resource again?
Of course.
Any other questions or comments anyone would like to share?
I think someone put a question in the chat about how do we feel about Asians who play up the Asian accent for comedic effect. Such a good question. I think it's a hard question because I think, yeah, it can tap into these stereotypes and whatnot. And at the same time, I'm sympathetic when it is Asian folks doing that because I think sometimes they can feel limited in what is appealing to other people. And or even thinking about Asians in the entertainment industry, a lot of times people don't want to necessarily audition for roles that perpetuate these tropes and stereotypes, but they feel like it's their only option in order to get to have a space in this world. And so I think it's such a great question, but also, yeah, I think there's a lot of tension and nuance there.
And then I saw that Donna asked if you'll have access to these slides. So we will include slides and other relevant links in our thank you email after this webinar concludes. And then if there are no other questions, I just have a few slides to share to close us out. First, just want to say thank you again to Megan for taking the time in today just to have such an insightful webinar for all of us. And then also thank you to everyone that has been participating and sharing your stories and experiences in the chat. If you do want to share any more of your feedback, we do have this feedback survey. You can scan the QR code on the screen or select the link in the chat. We do use all the responses from the survey just to gauge how the webinar went for you and how we can improve future programming. And we'll also include this link in our thank you email. Also, along with the list that Megan shared, we do have the compiled list with Yellow Chair Collective here, which has resources for therapy, anti-Asian racism, and books to guide you all in your healing and community organizing journeys, which will be included in the email as well. And then, as Megan had mentioned, we do have the last part of our series coming up in 2 weeks. So if you're not registered yet, you can click the link in the chat or scan the QR code here. And lastly, just want to ask for you to please follow us on Instagram, where you can look for more content on anti-Asian racism, book highlights, and other educational materials that we hope to share. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll send these slides to you all very soon and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.